Right after the World Cup wrapped up, something odd started happening on UK immigration forums and Facebook groups dedicated to moving abroad. Threads that used to get a handful of replies a week were suddenly filling up with hundreds of comments a day, and almost all of them were asking the same question: how do I actually move to America? This wasn't a small, quiet trend either. Search interest for American work visas, the green card lottery, and moving to the US spiked noticeably across the UK through July and into August 2026, right in the window after England, Scotland, and Wales fans came home from a month spent traveling through American host cities. A month earlier, most of these same people were making the usual jokes about American food, guns, and portion sizes. Now a lot of them are seriously filling out paperwork. Here's what actually happened between the final whistle and the sudden rush toward American embassies. Before we get into it, if you're into these kinds of culture and travel breakdowns, go ahead and subscribe now so the next one actually lands in your feed. Now let's get back to the video. Google Trends data for the UK showed a clear and fairly sharp rise in searches related to American immigration starting in the second half of July 2026, continuing well past the tournament's end. Terms like US work visa, EB3 visa, and move to America from UK all climbed noticeably compared to the same period in previous years, and immigration lawyers based in London and Manchester started reporting a jump in consultation requests almost immediately after fans began returning home. This kind of spike isn't unheard of after a major international event. Tourism boards have tracked similar bumps in interest after past World Cups and Olympics held in popular destinations. What made this particular spike stand out was how specifically it was tied to permanent relocation rather than just future holiday planning. People weren't asking where to go on their next trip. They were asking about sponsorship requirements, minimum salary thresholds, and how long a green card application typically takes to process. Online forums that cover American immigration law, usually dominated by users from India, Nigeria, and the Philippines, started seeing a noticeable uptick in British posters asking very basic starting questions, the kind that suggested a lot of them were completely new to the process and had never seriously considered it before this specific trip. Immigration consultants interviewed by a handful of UK outlets described the trend as unusual, specifically because of who was asking. Not people from countries with obvious economic pressure to leave, but middle-income British professionals who, on paper, already had a comfortable enough life at home. A few of these consultants noted that the timing lined up almost too neatly to be coincidence, with inquiry volumes climbing steadily through the tournament itself and then jumping sharply in the 2 weeks after fans actually flew home, rather than dropping off the way a typical holiday buzz usually does. Some firms reported having to bring on temporary staff just to handle the volume of initial consultation requests, most of which were coming from people who had never previously looked into American immigration at all. Facebook groups built around British expats in the US, some of which had sat relatively quiet for years, suddenly saw a wave of new members introducing themselves and asking practical questions about everything from shipping personal belongings to finding a realtor in a city they'd only visited once, for a few days, during the tournament. Whether all of that translates into actual completed moves remains genuinely uncertain, but the sheer volume of people taking that first serious step, rather than just liking a meme about it, was enough to catch the attention of immigration professionals who don't usually see this kind of pattern outside of countries facing an actual economic or political crisis at home. To understand why this spike happened, it helps to look at what these fans were actually posting from inside the United States during the tournament itself. Across thousands of short clips and vlogs filmed in host cities from Boston to Houston, the same handful of reactions kept showing up. Visitors describing walking through downtown areas late at night without any of the tension they'd expected, based on years of British news coverage about American crime. Fans posting about strangers paying for their meals without being asked, giving them rides after a car broke down, or inviting them to a family barbecue after a short conversation on the street. None of these were staged moments for the cameras. They were simply the small, repeated interactions that add up over a month spent traveling through a country. British visitors in particular seemed caught off guard by how openly friendly total strangers were, since that kind of casual warmth toward people you don't know is genuinely less common in most of the UK, where small talk with strangers can come across as intrusive rather than polite. On top of that, several fans described a level of everyday safety that didn't match the mental image they'd built up beforehand. Women walking alone at night without being bothered, unlocked vehicles left overnight without being touched, and a general sense of calm in ordinary public spaces that a lot of British news coverage simply doesn't show. None of this means the United States has no safety concerns of its own, since crime rates vary enormously by city and even by neighborhood within the same city. But for a British tourist moving through the specific downtown cores and stadium districts that host World Cup matches, the calm, ordinary reality of daily American life was consistently the opposite of what they'd been told to expect. A few specific stories kept resurfacing across different accounts, almost word for word, which is part of why they spread as far as they did. A group of fans in Nashville describing a bar tab quietly picked up by a stranger who left before anyone could thank them properly. A family in Ohio inviting a group of stranded Scottish fans in for dinner after their rental car broke down on a rural stretch of highway. Police officers in more than one host city posting videos of themselves dancing and taking photos with visiting fans instead of the tense, confrontational interactions British visitors sometimes expected based on news coverage. None of these moments were particularly dramatic on their own, but the sheer repetition of similar stories across completely unconnected travelers, in different cities, on different days, is what gave the trend its credibility online rather than getting dismissed as a one-off. British fans in particular seemed to process this as a genuine correction to a specific set of assumptions they'd carried for years. Not that America had no problems at all, but that the day-to-day experience of an ordinary visitor was considerably warmer and calmer than decades of headlines had led them to expect. Once the emotional reaction settled, a lot of returning fans started running actual numbers, and that's where things got more serious. Housing became the clearest comparison point. A similar amount of money that buys a small flat in London or Manchester can often buy a full house with a yard in states like Texas, Georgia, or Ohio. A gap that becomes especially stark once someone actually starts browsing listing sites out of curiosity, rather than just hearing about it secondhand. Everyday costs followed a similar pattern outside the most expensive American coastal cities, with groceries, fuel, and eating out frequently coming in cheaper than equivalent UK prices, even after accounting for the exchange rate. Wages in specific sectors added another layer to the comparison. Skilled trades in particular, plumbing, electrical work, truck driving, and similar hands-on professions, can pay noticeably more in parts of the United States than in the UK, partly because lower income tax rates leave more of that paycheck in an employee's pocket compared to what they'd take home after UK national insurance and income tax deductions. That comparison isn't universal across every profession or every American city, and it's worth being upfront that coastal metro areas like New York and San Francisco remain extremely expensive by any standard. But for someone working a trade or a mid-level technical job looking specifically at the American South or Midwest, the math genuinely worked out in favor of moving. Once returning fans actually sat down and compared take-home pay against everyday costs, rather than just going off vague impressions. Several people posting detailed spreadsheets in these forums broke the comparison down city by city, weighing average rent in Nashville or Columbus against a similar-sized flat in Leeds or Sheffield, and factoring in fuel costs, grocery bills, and eating out prices they'd tracked during the trip itself. A recurring theme in these breakdowns was just how much further a single income seemed to stretch once UK-style tax deductions were removed from the equation, even after accounting for the fact that many Americans have to independently budget for healthcare costs that would otherwise be covered automatically back home. It's worth noting that a chunk of this financial optimism came from a fairly narrow slice of the country, specific mid-sized cities in states with lower costs of living and no state income tax, rather than the country as a whole. Someone running the same numbers for New York or coastal California would land on a very different conclusion. But for fans who happen to spend their World Cup weeks in exactly those lower-cost regions, the financial case for relocating felt a lot more concrete than it would have if their trip had been centered entirely around one of America's more expensive coastal cities instead. Beyond the big financial arguments, a lot of the online conversation after the tournament kept circling back to smaller, almost trivial details that turned out to matter more than expected once people were home. Air conditioning was one of the most repeated examples, since a large share of UK homes still don't have any form of cooling installed, and a run of hot July and August nights back home suddenly felt a lot harder to sleep through after a month of consistently cool American interiors. Home size came up constantly as well, with returning fans posting side-by-side comparisons of an average new UK home, sitting at roughly 800 square feet, against the noticeably larger American houses many of them had stayed in or visited during the trip. Free public restrooms became something of an inside joke across several of these threads, a small convenience that doesn't sound like much until you've spent a month not having to hunt for change every time nature called, and then landed back at a UK train station that still charges for the privilege. None of these individual details would be enough on their own to convince someone to relocate an entire life across the Atlantic. But stacked together, air conditioning, space, free basic amenities, alongside the friendliness and safety fans had already been posting about, they created a cumulative sense that everyday life in America was simply built with more comfort baked into it as a default, rather than as something you had to pay extra to access. Several returning fans described a specific kind of restlessness in the days right after landing back home, walking into a small UK supermarket after a month of American superstores and feeling almost claustrophobic by comparison, or standing at a corner shop counter waiting to pay a small fee just to use the toilet, and suddenly finding the whole arrangement absurd in a way it never had before the trip. One fairly common post format that spread across several forums involved a simple before and after photo, an American kitchen or garage next to a UK equivalent, usually captioned with some version of a joke about how differently the same amount of money gets spent depending on which side of the Atlantic you're standing on. None of this reflects badly on the UK as a country, since it has its own genuine advantages in walkability, public transport, and access to the rest of Europe that America simply can't replicate. But for people freshly back from a month of American convenience, those advantages were harder to appreciate in the moment than the very specific, very tangible things they suddenly felt they were missing. It's worth being honest about the gap between posting in a forum thread and actually relocating a life to another country. American immigration law is genuinely complicated, and there's no simple, fast-track path for a British citizen who liked their holiday and wants to stay permanently. Most routes require either a job offer from a U.S. employer willing to sponsor a work visa, a close family relationship to an American citizen, entry through the annual green card lottery, which accepts a limited number of applicants each year, or a specialized visa category tied to specific skills or significant investment. None of these are quick, and most involve months or even years of paperwork, legal fees, and uncertainty before anything is finalized. Healthcare is another major factor that doesn't show up during a short holiday, but becomes immediately relevant for anyone actually living there long term, since the U.S. healthcare system is tied closely to employment and lacks the universal coverage that UK residents are used to through the NHS. Immigration lawyers who spoke to UK press outlets about this recent spike in interest were fairly consistent in their message, that genuine enthusiasm after a great trip is completely understandable, but actually pursuing a move requires a realistic look at visa sponsorship odds, healthcare costs, and the practical difficulty of qualifying for most of the available categories. A meaningful number of the people posting in these forums will likely never end up filing anything more than an initial inquiry, but the volume of people at least starting that inquiry, rather than just posting a joke about it and moving on, is what made this particular wave of interest different from the usual post-holiday daydreaming. A number of the lawyers who commented on this trend made a point of walking through the actual odds involved, since the annual green card lottery, officially called the Diversity Visa Program, accepts a genuinely small percentage of total applicants each year, and countries like the UK aren't always guaranteed eligibility depending on how the program's rules apply in a given year. Employer-sponsored visas require a U.S. company willing to go through a lengthy and fairly expensive legal process on the applicant's behalf, something that's realistically only available to people with in-demand technical skills or specialized experience a company can't easily find domestically. Family-based routes require an actual qualifying relationship with a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, not just a new friendship made during a month-long trip. Several lawyers were careful to note that they weren't trying to discourage anyone from exploring the process, only trying to set realistic expectations early, since a large share of the people reaching out were starting from essentially zero knowledge of how any of these categories actually worked, and a dose of practical information tended to either sharpen someone's resolve or gently redirect their expectations, depending on their specific situation. Put all of this together, and it's easier to see why this specific month turned into a genuine moment rather than just another round of online jokes. A month-long tournament gave British fans an unusually long, immersive exposure to everyday American life, far more than the typical week-long holiday most tourists experience, with enough time to move past the initial novelty and start noticing patterns in daily comfort, safety, and cost. That extended exposure landed at a point when housing affordability and cost of living pressures back in the UK were already a constant topic of public frustration, which meant the financial comparisons fans were making felt personally relevant rather than abstract. Add in a summer heatwave back home that made the lack of air conditioning in most UK housing feel especially frustrating, and the emotional and practical arguments for leaving ended up reinforcing each other at almost exactly the same time. None of this guarantees a genuine wave of permanent emigration is coming, since actually moving countries involves a level of cost, paperwork, and disruption that a viral forum thread can't fully capture. But the specific combination of an extended trip, a housing crisis back home, a summer heat wave, and a month of unexpectedly positive daily experiences in the US is a fairly unique set of circumstances, and it's a large part of why August 2026 turned into the moment when so many UK residents stopped joking about moving to America and started actually looking into how. There's also a social permission element worth mentioning, one that's easy to overlook. When a handful of people post about seriously considering a move, it can read as an odd, isolated decision. When thousands of people are posting almost identical sentiments within the same few weeks, each one gives the next person a bit more confidence that it isn't a strange overreaction, it's a shared response to a shared experience. That kind of collective validation tends to accelerate a trend far faster than any single viral post could on its own, since people scrolling through these threads see their own reaction mirrored back at them dozens of times over, which makes the idea feel less like a fantasy and more like something worth actually researching properly. Whether this particular wave settles back down over the next few months, the way most post-holiday enthusiasm eventually does, or whether it turns into a genuine, measurable rise in UK to US relocations over the next year or two, is something that will only really become clear once immigration data from the following months starts coming in. So here's the real question worth sitting with. If the paperwork, the visa odds, and the healthcare costs weren't standing in the way, would you actually make the move yourself? Or is this more of a really good holiday talking? Let us know where you land on that in the comments. And if you've gone through any part of this process yourself, we'd like to hear how it actually went for you. If you found this one interesting, hit like and subscribe so you catch the next video in this series. This video is compiled from publicly available search data, traveler accounts, and general reporting for entertainment and discussion purposes, and it isn't intended as immigration or legal advice.